Good evening. Hope everyone's doing well, staying safe and healthy. Tonight we're going to continue our conversation on reading the Bible by jumping into historical narratives. Now, historical narratives are the most common type of literature found in the Bible. We can see this in Genesis through halfway through Exodus. We can see this Joshua through Esther, Jonah, and even in the New Testament with the book of Acts. Historical narratives, as we can already see, can be described as accounts of historical events. But not only that, but also their effects on God's people. So as we're jumping into historical narratives tonight, I kind of want to first begin with defining who God's people are. Now in the Old Testament, we see that God's people are the Israelites. And in the New Testament, we can see that God's people are the followers of Jesus, the Christians. So I think that we should remember this distinction while we read each of the narratives, the Old Testament and the New Testament narratives. But we should also not shy away from the Old Testament narratives if we are Christians, because that is your history too. So don't shy away from those just because you think that that's not your history as well. But also don't be mistaken. Though God's people help drive historical narratives, the narratives themselves are ultimately about the identity and the ways of God. They're not about His people. The story that these narratives tell is God's story. His people are just a part of it. So keep that in mind at the forefront while you're reading these historical narratives. So what are historical narratives? Let's get into a deeper dive into this. At their basic level, historical narratives tell us about things that happened in the past. But not only that, but they also can help us understand how things came to be the way they are. Take, for example, the narrative account of the creation in the book of Genesis. You can see how things came to be the way they are. However, these historical accounts are not exhaustive. They're selective. Okay, I'll tell you what I mean by that. You won't really find every single detail of the history of God and His people in these books. Even in the Gospel of John, we see John did not write exhaustively about the life of Christ. We can see in verse number 25 in the 21st chapter, it says, "And there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written." So John didn't even write an exhaustive biography on Christ. So these historical narratives are similar. They don't show a complete 100% picture of everything, right? The history of God and His people, but only the essentials are a part of these stories. So we can see filmmakers also kind of do this when they're adapting books into movies, right? We see that they leave things out, not because they aren't important to the story, but simply because you don't necessarily need them, the things that are left out. You don't necessarily need them to understand the story. So that's kind of the same thing that these authors did when writing historical narratives. We can also see that historical narratives show us that in all of biblical literature, God is our protagonist, not man. Historical narratives ultimately help us see God's greatness in the light of man's sin. That's why historical narratives are descriptive, but not necessarily normative. Because man sinned, these narratives, they describe what happened. But because of the sin of man, they don't necessarily instruct us on how we are to live, right? They just simply describe what took place and how these people live their lives. For example, we can see in 1 Kings, chapter 4, verse 30, that King Solomon was described as being the wisest man of his time. And then we can see, jump ahead a few chapters, in chapter number 11, we can see that Solomon was also described as having many wives. Though polygamy is not being condoned here in this passage. It's simply describing how Solomon lived his life, not condoning the way he lived his life necessarily. We can see this if we take a look in the first letter of Paul to Timothy, we go to chapter number 3. Now, this is a book, an epistle is a book that does instruct us on how we are to live our lives. So if we look at this, it says, a bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife. So here Paul's clearly teaching against polygamy. So as we see King Solomon having multiple wives, not necessarily something we should, of course, reflect, but something that's just describing the way he lived his life. So a distinction must be made between the two, descriptive and normative. So make that distinction as you read through the text. Historical narratives are also not always in chronological order. We see this sometimes, instead of chronological order, they are in thematic order. So just because two similar events are written back to back, it doesn't necessarily mean that they happen simultaneously. Just as in today's literature, authors and editors of the Bible were very aware of thematic similarities in stories and events, and sometimes they structured their biblical accounts in a way that allows the reader to understand and see those thematic similarities themselves. So not always in chronological order. So what do historical narratives look like then? Well, unlike what we're used to today, ancient Hebrew narratives were written primarily to be heard and not read, mainly because the scribes would read them aloud because not a lot of people were literate in the culture, but so they're meant to be read aloud rather than read to oneself. So the structure of many of these narratives is one which allows for easy memorization and recall. Writers would use specific structural features to allow for this. One such feature we can see is repetition. Many authors would repeat key words and phrases. They would also sometimes interrupt their own narratives by adding details of the narrative or even telling a side story in the middle of their narrative. Then upon returning to their original narrative story, they would repeat where they left off. We can see this in Genesis chapter number 37, verse 36, with the story of Joseph. Let's just read that here. It says, "And the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard." Now, from chapters 38 all the way to chapter 39, it tells of a different story. Okay, it says, "And it came to pass at that time," and then the author tells a different story, but then jumps back to the Joseph story in chapter number 39, verse 1 says, "And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither." So it picks up right where it left off by repeating the last line. So authors would do that in many other occasions in historical narratives as well. We can also see that sometimes they would give a general overview of an account and then later go back and fill in details of that account. We can see this in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. We can see a general overview in chapter 1 and then a more detailed account of the creation in chapter 2. And another key structural feature that authors used to allow for memorization and quick recall is the inclusio. So an inclusio is when an author begins a narrative and ends it in the same way, whether it be using similar words or similar themes, and the introduction sort of mirrors the conclusion. Authors often use inclusios in whole books as well, not just the one passage. This also sometimes occurred within a narrative, having the entirety of the first half of the narrative mirror the entirety of the second half of the narrative. So kind of think of it like having a mirror directly in the middle of the narrative. The first half and the second half are mirrors of each other. It's super cool the way some of these authors did this. And we can see that they occur heavily in wisdom and poetic literature, but we can also see that they occurred in historical narratives as well. The story of Joseph, going right back to it, in Genesis is an example. At the beginning of the narrative, Joseph has a dream about his brothers bowing down to him, and by the end of the story, that exact thing happens. So inclusio, beginning and end, mirror one another. So now that we know kind of what historical narratives are and what they look like, how do we look at them? How should we look at them? Well, when looking at historical narratives, we should be able to separate them from the rest of the Bible as being individual accounts. But we must also be able to see them in the light of the biblical story as a whole. That sounds confusing, but don't worry, there's a method, and it's called the three-level narrative approach. That I kind of just made that up, but the method is real, I promise. I was taught to look at this method, through this method, to look at narratives from the top down, but I think that we should start from the bottom up, and you'll see what I mean by that. Take notes. The first level is we need to look at the specific story that this narrative is telling. Look at the story that the author is actually telling. That is important. So after the first level, once we know and understand what this actual story is, the literal story of what the author is saying, the second level is to look at God redeeming his people and how God redeems his people. Look at the story in the light of God's redemption towards his people. How does this story show God's redemptive power to his people? And we can see that in the Old Testament. His people were the Israelites. How does this story show the redemptive power of God to the Israelites? And then we can go to his New Testament people. How does this story show the redemptive power of God to Christians? And so those are the first two levels. And then the top level, which is a major one, is the meta-narrative. We must look at the meta-narrative of the Bible, the salvation history. So basically, how do we see Christ and God's saving grace through this story? That is the top level. First level, the specific story. Second level, how God redeems his people. And the third level, the biblical salvation story. How do we see Christ in this story? Don't simply look at one level, but look at all three. Separate the specific narrative from all other parts of the Bible, but then bring it back together. All three levels, very important for biblical interpretation. So as we begin to read and interpret the Bible, it's important that we first know what we are reading and how to read it. Historical narratives, in this case, are a great place to start, I think, because they make up so much of the Bible story. And by jumping into historical narrative first, it can kind of set off the course of jumping into the rest of the biblical genres and the different books of the Bible, all a part of God's story. So I hope this video was helpful to you. I hope it blessed you in some way. If it did, if you learned something from it, let me know. Share it with someone else who you think could gain something from this. And we're going to look at some more biblical genres next and continue going through how to read the Bible, as well as just different aspects of the Bible. So if you enjoyed, let me know. Thanks for watching. Hope this blessed you today. All right, see you next time.